The well house. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into what would be my home for the next 3 months. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight from Portland, and the sight of the little white farmhouse nestled between rolling fields made me exhale for what felt like the first time in weeks. This was exactly what I needed: space, quiet, and distance from everything that had gone wrong in my life. I stepped out of my car and stretched, breathing in air that actually smelled clean. No exhaust fumes, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, no reminders of suffocating city life. Just the sound of wind through tall grass and the distant call of some bird I couldn't identify. For the first time since I'd walked out of Dr. Martinez's office with those final test results, I felt like I could actually breathe. The farmhouse was smaller than it had appeared in the online photos, but that was fine. I only needed space for my laptop, my drawing tablet, and enough room to spread out reference materials for the biggest project of my freelance career. 3 months of solitude to nail this contract and prove I could still work, still create, still be useful. Despite what the doctors had told me about my future, a rusty pickup truck approached from the direction of the main road, dust trailing behind it like a brown banner. The landlord, I assumed. Mr. Henley climbed out slowly, the kind of deliberate movement that spoke of arthritic joints and too many years of farm work. He was exactly what Central Casting would order for rural Oregon farmer. Weathered face, flannel shirt, work boots that had seen decades of honest labor. "You must be Maya," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Hope the drive wasn't too rough. GPS tend to take folks the long way out here." "It was fine," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and warm, so different from the sterile handshakes I'd grown accustomed to in waiting rooms and specialists' offices. "The place looks perfect, even better than the photos." Mr. Henley nodded, but something flickered across his expression, too quick for me to interpret. "Well, let's get you settled then. Got the keys right here." He led me up the front steps, pointing out practical details as we went. The propane tank for the stove, the electrical panel in the basement, the quirks of the old plumbing. Standard landlord information, delivered in the patient tone of someone who'd given this tour many times before. "Internet satellite," he mentioned as we stepped inside. "Sometimes gets a little spotty, especially during storms. Phone service too, for that matter. You'll want to keep your cell charged." The interior was cozy in the way only old houses could be. Hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, windows that actually opened, built-in shelves that showed decades of careful maintenance. It felt lived in rather than sterile, which was perfect. I could already envision my workspace set up by the large window overlooking the back field. "Previous tenant leave anything behind?" I asked, noticing a few random items. A coffee mug in the sink, a paperback novel on the windowsill. "Ah, yeah," Mr. Henley scratched his beard. "Sarah left in a bit of a hurry. Family emergency back east. Said I could just donate whatever she didn't take. Haven't gotten around to clearing it out yet." We finished the indoor tour and stepped onto the back porch. The view was spectacular, rolling fields dotted with wildflowers, a line of Douglas firs marking the property boundary, and beyond that, the kind of endless forest that made you remember how small you really were. "Beautiful," I murmured, already planning where I'd set up my morning coffee routine. Mr. Henley's voice had changed, becoming more cautious. "Now, there's one thing I need to mention. You see that structure out there, about 50 yards back?" I followed his pointing finger to a small stone building I hadn't noticed before. It was maybe 8 feet square, with a peaked roof and a heavy wooden door. Ivy had claimed most of the walls, making it look like something from a fairy tale. "That's the old well house," he continued. "Been there since my grandfather's time. Doors locked for safety reasons. The well inside goes down pretty deep, and we don't want anyone falling in." "Of course," I said. "Is the water still good?" "Oh no, no. House has been on municipal water for decades. The old well's well, it's just old. Point is, I'd appreciate if you stayed clear of it. Foundation's not what it used to be, and I'd hate for you to get hurt poking around." Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. He was staring at the well house with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but definitely unease. "No problem," I assured him. "I'm here to work anyway, not explore." "Good, good." He seemed to relax slightly. "Well then, I think that covers everything. My number's on the refrigerator if you need anything. Nearest grocery store's in Millbrook, about 20 minutes back toward the highway." After he left, I spent the afternoon unloading my car and getting settled. The previous tenant, Sarah, had good taste. The furniture was comfortable without being fancy, and she'd left behind a decent coffee maker and some basic kitchen supplies. I found a few more of her belongings scattered around, a sweater draped over a chair, a half-used bottle of shampoo in the shower, a small stack of books on the nightstand. It really did seem like she'd left in a hurry. As evening approached, I set up my workspace by the back window and fired up my laptop to check email. I made myself dinner from supplies I'd brought. That's when I first heard it. A soft rhythmic sound from outside. Metal on metal, like someone tapping a wrench against a pipe. I glanced out the window, but the backfield was empty, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Probably just the old well house settling, I told myself. Old buildings made all kinds of noises. I worked until nearly midnight making good progress on the initial concepts. The isolation was already proving beneficial. No distractions, no interruptions, just me and the work. I brushed my teeth, changed into pajamas, and climbed into the surprisingly comfortable bed. I was almost asleep when my laptop chimed with an email notification. Annoyed with myself for forgetting to turn off notifications, I grabbed my phone to check the time. 3:17 a.m. That was weird. I'd only been in bed for maybe 20 minutes. The email was spam anyway, something about extending my car warranty. I deleted it and rolled over, but now I was wide awake. The bedroom was completely dark except for the faint glow of my phone, and utterly silent except for... There it was again. That metallic tapping sound coming from the direction of the well house. I lay there listening for several minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep, thinking I'd have to ask Mr. Henley about it in the morning. The next day dawned bright and clear, perfect for a morning run before diving into work. I'd always been an early riser, and the rural setting seemed to demand greeting the sunrise properly. I laced up my running shoes and headed out the front door, planning to explore the property boundaries. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of grass and wildflowers that made my city-accustomed lungs feel grateful. I jogged along what looked like an old farm road, now mostly overgrown, that led toward the tree line. That's when I found the first one. It was small, maybe 3 inches tall, carved from what looked like pine. A simple human figure, arms at its sides, face smooth and featureless. Someone had placed it carefully on a tree stump, positioned so it faced the house. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The carving was crude but deliberate, the kind of thing someone might make during long winter evenings. A folk art piece, maybe left behind by a previous tenant or a local kid. I pocketed the figure and continued my run, but found two more before I made it back to the house. Both were identical to the first, both positioned to face the farmhouse. By the time I got back, I had 3 wooden figures and a growing sense of curiosity. Over coffee, I examined them more carefully. They were definitely handmade, carved with simple tools. The wood was weathered, but not ancient. These had been exposed to the elements for months, not years. Sarah's work, maybe, some kind of art project. I set them on the kitchen windowsill and forgot about them until that evening when I was cleaning up dinner. The internet had cut out again at exactly 3:17 a.m. the night before. I checked my phone when the email notification woke me up and the Wi-Fi symbol had been grayed out. Now, as I rinsed dishes, I glanced out at the well house and noticed something that made me pause. The metallic sound was back, but this time I could see what was causing it. The door of the well house was moving slightly, as if something inside was pushing against it in a steady rhythm. Push, pause, push, pause. The heavy padlock clinked against the metal hasp with each movement. I dried my hands and stepped onto the back porch for a better look. The door was definitely moving, maybe an inch each time, enough to make the lock hardware rattle, but there was no wind. The evening air was perfectly still. As I watched, the movement stopped abruptly. The well house stood silent and motionless, as if it had never moved at all. Probably just the wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes, I told myself. Old buildings did that. The door probably didn't fit the frame perfectly anymore, and the daily heating and cooling cycle made it shift. But even as I rationalized it away, I found myself staring at the well house longer than necessary, waiting to see if it would move again. It didn't, at least not while I was watching. That night, I made sure to turn off all email notifications before going to bed, but I still woke up at 3:17 a.m. anyway, pulled from sleep by some internal alarm I couldn't explain. The room was dark and quiet, and when I checked my phone, the Wi-Fi was down again. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around me, and tried not to think about the rhythmic tapping that had started up again outside my window. By the end of my first week, I'd fallen into a comfortable routine. Coffee at sunrise, morning run through the fields, work until late afternoon, then dinner and more work until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The isolation was working exactly as I'd hoped. The internet still cut out every night at 3:17 a.m., but I'd learned to work around it. I saved my files religiously and stopped checking email after midnight. The metallic sounds from the well house had become part of the background noise, like the settling of old wood or the distant hum of the refrigerator. I barely noticed them anymore. What I did notice was that the wooden figures kept multiplying. Every few days, I'd find new ones during my morning runs, always positioned to face the house, always carved in the same crude style. I'd collected 8 so far, lining them up on the kitchen windowsill like a tiny wooden army. Sarah must have been quite the prolific carver, I thought. It was during my second week that I found the journal. I'd been reorganizing the bedroom, moving Sarah's leftover books to make room for my own things, when I noticed the floorboard by the window was slightly raised. When I pressed on it, it shifted with a soft creak. Curious, I worked my fingers into the gap and lifted the board. Underneath was a small space, probably carved out decades ago to hide valuables. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, but the writing still clear. The first entry was dated 3 months earlier, written in careful cursive, March 15th. Finally got settled in the farmhouse. It's perfect for what I need. Quiet, isolated, good light for painting. Mr. Henley seems nice enough, though he got oddly specific about staying away from the old well house, as if I'd want to go poking around some crumbling outbuilding anyway. I flipped through several pages of mundane entries, notes about work projects, observations about wildlife, complaints about the spotty internet. Then the tone began to shift. March 28th. Keep finding these strange little wooden figures around the property. They're kind of charming in a way. The carving is primitive, but there's something almost deliberate about their placement. Always facing the house, like they're watching. April 2nd. The internet has been cutting out every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. Called the provider, but they say there's no scheduled maintenance. Probably just the satellite adjusting or something. Rural living, I guess. April 8th. Had the strangest dream last night. I was standing by a well, drawing up bucket after bucket of water, but the buckets were always empty when they reached the top. There was someone behind me, whispering instructions I couldn't quite understand. Woke up with dirt under my fingernails. I set the journal aside, feeling oddly uncomfortable. Sarah's experiences sounded exactly like mine, down to the 3:17 a.m. internet outages, but dreams about wells? I tried to remember if I'd had any unusual dreams since arriving, but mostly I'd been sleeping deeply, exhausted from the long work days. That night, I found myself paying closer attention to the sounds from the well house. They seemed more complex now, less like random settling and more like rhythm, as if something was moving in there with purpose, following a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. I made myself tea and returned to Sarah's journal, reading by lamplight. April 15th. The sounds from the well house are getting louder, or maybe I'm just becoming more aware of them. It's not random creaking, there's definitely a pattern. 3 short taps, pause, 2 long ones, pause, repeat. Like Morse code, but not any sequence I recognize. April 20th. Found muddy footprints on the back porch this morning, barefoot, huge, and oddly placed. They were pointing the wrong way, toward the house from the direction of the well house, then back again, as if someone had walked from there to here, then returned, but there's no one living nearby. April 25th. The dreams are getting more vivid. Always the same scene, drawing water from a well that never fills the bucket. But now I can hear the voice more clearly. It's not asking me to bring something up from the depths, it's telling me I'm going to go down. My hands were trembling slightly as I turned the page. This was getting too specific, too similar to my own experience. But I'd never had dreams about wells, had I? May 1st. Broke down and called Mr. Henley about the sounds. He got very agitated, kept insisting I stay away from the well house. When I pressed him about it, he said something about old agreements and keeping it fed. Then he seemed to realize what he'd said and claimed he was just talking about keeping raccoons out of the garbage. May 8th. The wooden figures are moving, not on their own. Something is dragging them around at night. I watched from the window and saw them being pulled across the yard by some invisible force, their wooden bodies scraping against the ground. In the morning, they're always in new positions, closer to the house. I closed the journal and walked to the kitchen window. My collection of wooden figures sat on the sill, motionless in the lamplight. 8 crude, little people, all facing inward toward the house. They looked innocent enough, like the kind of craft project you'd find at a county fair. But as I stared at them, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. They weren't in the same positions I'd left them that morning. They'd been spread out along the windowsill, evenly spaced. Now they were clustered together in the center, as if something had pushed them into a huddle. I reached out to touch one, then pulled my hand back. My rational mind insisted they must have shifted when I'd been cleaning, or maybe vibrations from closing the window had moved them. But Sarah's words echoed in my head, being pulled across the yard by some invisible force. That night, I woke at 3:17 a.m. as usual, but this time I was ready. I'd set my phone to record video, positioned to capture the wooden figures on the windowsill. If something was moving them, I'd have proof. But when I checked the recording in the morning, it showed 8 hours of motionless figures. Nothing had disturbed them during the night. Yet when I looked at the windowsill, they were gone. I found them outside, arranged in a perfect circle around the well house. Standing in the morning dew, barefoot in my pajamas, I stared at the ring of carved figures. Each one faced inward toward the stone building, as if they were standing guard. The grass around them was disturbed, showing clear drag marks where they'd been pulled across the field. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Someone was playing an elaborate prank. The local kids had found my collection and decided to mess with the city girl, but who? I hadn't seen another human being since Mr. Henley's visit 2 weeks ago. I gathered the figures and brought them back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was interrupting something important. As I placed them back on the windowsill, I noticed one was different from the others. The carving was more detailed, with tiny scratches that might have been facial features, and unlike the others, this one wasn't facing the house, it was facing me. That afternoon, I called the sheriff's office in Millbrook. The dispatcher listened patiently as I explained about the wooden figures and the sounds from the well house, though I left out the parts about them being dragged around, even to my own ears. It sounded paranoid and disconnected from reality. "Ma'am, sounds like you might be experiencing some cabin fever," the deputy said kindly. "Happens to folks who aren't used to rural isolation. Kids do like to play pranks on newcomers, and old buildings make all kinds of noises. Why don't you get out more? Maybe drive into town for dinner." But getting out felt impossible, and besides, something was keeping me here. Not fear exactly, but a growing sense that I was part of something larger than myself, that leaving now would mean abandoning some crucial responsibility I didn't yet understand. Sarah's journal had more entries, but I was almost afraid to read them. Instead, I threw myself into work, staying up later and later, trying to ignore the increasingly complex sounds from the well house. The 3-tap, 2-tap pattern had evolved into something longer, more intricate. Sometimes it sounded almost like music. On my third Friday at the farmhouse, I woke not at 3:17 a.m., but at 2:45. Something had pulled me from sleep, not the usual internet notification, but a different kind of awareness. The house felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't name. I got up and padded to the kitchen for water, not bothering to turn on lights. The moon was full, casting everything in silver. As I reached for a glass, I glanced out at the well house and froze. The door was open. I stood at the sink, glass in hand, staring at the dark rectangle where the door should have been. The heavy padlock that Mr. Henley had shown me was supposed to keep it secure, hung open on its hasp. But I could see into the building, and there was nothing there but deeper darkness. As I watched, something pale moved in the shadows inside, not quite human-shaped, but close enough to make my heart race. It seemed to be climbing, hand over hand, pulling itself up from some great depth. I blinked and the door was closed again. The padlock hung in place as if it had never been disturbed. But the image was burned into my mind, that pale, ascending figure, the sense of something emerging from far below. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the sounds from the well house, which had changed again. Now they sounded less like tapping and more like scraping, as if something was clawing its way up through stone. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on my back porch. They were large and bare, just as Sarah had described in her journal, but seeing them myself was different from reading about them. The prints were too distinct to be imagination, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone, or something, had walked from the direction of the well house to my door, stood there for a while, then returned the same way. I followed the trail across the dew-soaked grass. The prints were clear in the soft earth, each toe individually visible. They led directly to the well house, then simply stopped at the closed door. With shaking hands, I called Mr. Henley. "Footprints, you say?" His voice was carefully neutral. "Probably just some kids from town. They like to explore the old properties." "Barefoot kids? At 3 in the morning?" There was a long pause. "Maya, I think maybe you should consider coming back to town for a few days. Take a break from the isolation. Sometimes the mind can play tricks when you're alone too long." But I couldn't leave, not now. And not when every instinct I had was screaming that something important was happening here, something that required my presence. That night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I made coffee, positioned myself at the kitchen table with a clear view of the well house, and waited. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the internet went down as usual, but this time, something else happened.